Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today's video is going to be the third installment in a series of presentations that I've been making on the development of my new layout. If you haven't watched parts 1 and 2, I highly encourage you to. In the first two parts, I talk about how I was inspired by Lance Mindheims to rethink how I develop a layout plan and a track design. I haven't been happy with the current layout, so I wanted to go ahead and build a new one. And this series of presentations is sort of my thought process on developing and designing the new layout. So definitely check those out. The slide you see here is the summary of what I've come up with in the first two presentations. I'm not going to read through this, but this is pretty much everything that I'm going to use, the information I'm going to use moving forward on developing the track design. So something I was thinking about after I made the last video is a railroad's story. What is the story of any railroad? Each railroad across the world has a story, so it's important to know the story of your own railroad, whether it's a freelanced or prototype railroad. Now I'm going to go through some of the details that I've come up with, but of course this can change a little bit over time. Honestly, I typed this up pretty quick, but I think it's pretty believable, and I think that that's key when developing a story and also developing, designing, and building a model railroad. If you saw any of my update videos of the current layout, you would know that the last one I talked about how I was coming up with my first freelance railroad, and that was the Prescott Terminal Railway. Now I've gone ahead and I've changed that name a little bit to the Prescott Central Railway, and I'll explain to you why in just a bit here. You can see that the railroad is very short, only a half-mile long, and the owner is a company called Central Products. And again, this is some details that I'll get into. But if you saw that update video, you'll know that Central Products is an industry that I was modeling. And then the two customers on this railroad are, of course, Central Products and Prescott Transload. And again, I'll mention those in a little bit. So the history of the Prescott Central Railway. So Central Products purchased a paper mill complex that was adjacent to an abandoned Guilford or Pan Am branch line spur in the fictional town of Prescott, Massachusetts back in 1992. And this paper mill complex was converted to a ceramic pellet manufacturing facility in 93. This is the main product that Central Products makes, is ceramic pellets. They're used in CNC milling for the finishing process. So rail service was restored to that facility in 2003, about a decade after the facility was converted. And I'm kind of visualizing that they were using truck service during this time, and it just wasn't sufficient. So they decided that they needed to utilize that rail spur that was adjacent to the facility. So they went ahead and they purchased the half-mile long branch line from Guilford, since Guilford wasn't interested anymore in using that part of the line. So Central Products went ahead and purchased it, set up an interchange agreement between Guilford and Prescott Central in 2003. So Central Products purchases their first locomotive in late 2003, and then for a few years, they are resuming normal business, but they want to add more revenue. So they go ahead and they add a team track and transload facility on the Prescott Central line. This boosts their revenue, and now they are full-fledged railroad and interchanging cars every single day. So that's a little bit about the story. Obviously, you can get very detailed with this, but I think it's something that's very important to know before you can even design or build your layout. We're on to step 2 now, designing the layout. We're going to take a look at a few things. We're going to look at the examination of the usable layout space that I have. We're going to talk about what style of bench work is best for that space. We'll go over some construction parameters, and then we'll talk about layout zones and the physical layout elements that are going to be included in those zones. So the room footprint. You can see here I've got a schematic showing that the room is 9 feet by 8.5 feet. I originally put that the layout was 9 feet by 9 feet, or the room rather, but I forgot that during the build of this current layout, I discovered that the room itself is not perfectly square. This layout, current layout, was built in this cedar planked sort of walk-in closet that was in the basement the previous owner had constructed. And when I was building that layout, for the life of me, I couldn't figure out why my measurements were off, and I discovered that the room was not perfectly square. So on one wall, it's a full 9 feet, but the other is closer to 8.5 feet. It was a very confusing time, trust me, I could not figure it out. But once I realized the room wasn't perfectly square, I was able to to go ahead and build the layout. So we're going to factor in this 8.5 feet by 9 feet for the actual layout build itself. So the benchwork considerations. I've got a few shapes here. Obviously, there's a lot more. You could have all kinds of shapes, but I think these are the basics that we can cover. So you have linear, L-shaped, U-shaped, and E-shaped, or sort of a U-shaped layout with a peninsula in the middle. Now, thinking about the space that I have, linear would certainly work, but I think it's too simple, and I could go ahead and do a little bit more with the space that I have. So L-shaped certainly fits this idea, and U-shaped does as well. E-shaped would be cool, but I think that peninsula is just not necessary for what I want to do. I think it's going to be a little too much. So we're going to eliminate linear, we're going to eliminate E-shaped. Now L-shaped would work, but again, I want to have as much operations as I can, as much realistic operations as I can in this small space. So I think U-shaped is going to fit the bill well. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to plan for a U-shaped layout. Now you can see this schematic to the right. I've got that U-shaped bench work in there. And then I also have a workbench. This was something that I wanted to include in my layout room as well. And then I put a little note, storage underneath. So basically, this is going to be IKEA Ivar shelving for the supports. The parameters. It's a U-shaped layout. It's going to be a 16-inch width. It's going to be 1x3 grid construction with 16-inch centers. And then again, the supports are going to be the IKEA Ivar shelving. So I chose a 16-inch width because I can take one sheet of plywood and cut it into thirds, or rather I can have the lumberyard cut it into thirds and use it for all 3 legs of the layout. Now I put a note down here at the bottom. It says, shorten right leg. Now, the doorway is a little bit of an issue with the full 9-foot leg. You wouldn't be able to get into the room if you use the full 9 feet. So I've gone ahead and I've cut it back to 8 feet, but I'm thinking I might cut it back a little bit more. And this is something that I'm going to play around with a little bit more. But at least this diagram will show you that one leg, the right leg of the layout, is going to be a little bit shorter than the others. I wanted to use shelf brackets with 18-inch hollow core doors in this room originally. That's something that Lance Mindheims recommends for layout construction. It's very simple and easy to build. Unfortunately, I couldn't do that with this room because the cedar planked closet that I have in the basement doesn't have studs at the appropriate distances to be able to include the brackets, so it wasn't going to work, hence the reason I needed to choose some freestanding supports like the IKEA shelving. So the layout zones. So using the U-shaped benchwork in the diagram to the right, we can see that I've got 3 zones. I have 2 industrial zones and a scenic zone. And this scenic zone is the separation, the negative space, as Lance Mindheims calls it, between these industrial zones. And I think this is really important to include. You want your trains to feel like they're coming and going from places. You don't want them to just go right from one industry to the next. There needs to be a little bit of that space. So I like the idea of having this scenic zone as the separation. And this wouldn't work with an L-shaped layout. You could possibly have one leg as a scenic zone and the other is the industrial zone to add in that feeling of distance. But I think that this is going to work well for the U-shaped layout. And just something to note here, no spurs on the scenic zone if possible. Again, Lance Mindheims recommends this. You want to keep everything limited in that scenic zone. It should just simply be somewhere for the train to pass through with no action happening on it. Physical layout elements. I wanted to include some very specific things in the layout design. I wanted to include an interchange, classification tracks or a yard. I wanted to include 2 industries, the team track and the ceramic pellet manufacturer that I mentioned in the beginning of the video for the railroad story. I chose both of these industries because they each allow for a variety of car types to come in and out. So the team track obviously can allow pretty much anything, and the ceramic pellet manufacturer will have boxcars shipping in packaging material or shipping out finished product, depending on how you want to run the operation. You'll have covered hoppers. These would be pressure aid hoppers with a powdered binding agent. And then you'll have slurry tanks that are going to deliver the clay slurry that's going to be converted into the ceramic pellets itself. The last thing I wanted to discuss is a series of self-reflection questions that I've come up with about what I've developed so far for my layout plan. So the first question has to do with the layout room. Is this layout room being utilized to its fullest potential? I think it is, but I want to go ahead and spend the next week reflecting on what I've come up with so far. I want to make sure that this plan is going to work, that the shape is correct, that the style of the benchwork is correct. Is the position of the workbench good? I want to think about all of these elements. The next question is the benchwork style the best choice? So this goes back to the linear, the L-shaped, U-shaped, and E-shaped layouts. I think the style that I've come up with, the U-shaped layout, is certainly the best choice, but again, I'm going to reflect on this a little bit more and make sure I've made a good decision. And then the last question, are the planned elements a good fit? In other words, does the combination of elements make sense together? So this question, when I wrote it, is referring to the two industries on the layout, the ceramic pellet manufacturer and the team track. Do these two industries work together? And again, Lance Mindheims mentions this in his blog that you want the elements of your layout to work together. You don't want to have two things that are next to one another that you wouldn't really see in the real world. I'd love to hear your feedback on this. And if you think they work together, great. And if you don't, I'd love to hear why. And if you have any suggestions on which industries might be a better fit, I'd love to hear that as well. So be sure to leave a comment below. So that's all I have for you in this video presentation. As I mentioned before, I've got one more presentation I'm going to come up with next week. And in that one, we're going to go over the track design that I've hopefully come up with over the next week or so. But as always, I appreciate you taking the time to watch. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you.